Salam, hello, bonjour. Welcome everyone to the channel. I'm Adnan Hussein, historian of the medieval Mediterranean and Islamicate world or worlds. Welcome again to the show. As you know, this is a new channel. Video production is not cheap, so I want to ask you if you can support the channel to go to patreon.com/Adnan Hussein and help us keep this sustainable and continuing to make great content with outstanding guests. But at the very least, since we're always committed to making sure all of the political education, the history, the analysis is available free to everyone, if you can at least like, share this video and subscribe to the channel, it would be much appreciated. But as I said, we've had a lot of great guests talking about our world, about racism, about capitalism, usually from a historical or conceptual perspective. And I'm really delighted that today we'll have a chance to continue in that vein, speaking about very important contemporary topics, but with a historical analysis about race in this country, about immigration, about the rising levels and transformations of fascistic kind of far-right policies and politics in the United States, and how it relates to the changing global order and war and ethno-national ethnic cleansing and genocide. And to talk about all of these issues and their interconnections, as I said, I'm delighted to have a wonderful guest who's well known to many of you. He's a longtime, kind of contributor to many different shows, but also to Guerrilla History, on which I am co-host. And he's appeared on this channel before, and I think may have been the person who coined the title of an important episode, Team Barbarism is Winning. Unfortunately, they seem to keep winning and winning, but we'll find where the places of resistance are, I'm sure, in our analysis with Professor Alexander Aviña from Arizona State University, author of Specters of Revolution, Peasant Guerrillas in the Cold War Mexican Countryside. Welcome, Alex, back to the show.
Hey, Adnan, thank you so much for having me back.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here because I've been really feeling like it's important to have some kind of contextual and historical analysis of a phenomenon a few weeks ago that, is an example of a kind of spontaneous resistance that emerged to the ongoing ICE raids that happened in Los Angeles. And it just took me back in some ways to one of the really important formative moments in my political consciousness, besides the Iraq War, the first Iraq War, the Gulf War, was the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles. And of course, I was too young to have witnessed, or I wasn't alive at the time of the Watts uprising, but that wasn't something that was drawn at that time as an analogy. But I haven't heard that much historical analysis about, how to really think and situate the similarities and differences between various kinds of popular resistance that have emerged in Los Angeles in comparing those two. But that's something that came to my mind. And so I just wanted to ask you, when these uprisings took place 2-3 weeks ago initially, how did you put these in context? Is it something very unprecedented, the way in which these ICE raids have elicited this response? Were you surprised by them? How did you kind of think and make sense of what was going on in these communities?
No, I think that's a great question. So does this mean you weren't at the 92 Urban Rebellion, Adnan? You weren't out there taking on LAPD?
I kind of was in I was in Berkeley, Oakland, and we had, our own protests in sympathy with what was happening.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it didn't really pop off in San Luis Obispo, where I grew up. So for those of you who know California, you'll understand why the meaning behind my statement, I guess. No, I think what happened a couple weekends ago, particularly in the communities of Paramount and the neighboring community of Compton, is, I think some of the framing tried to describe what was essentially a community uprising as somehow spontaneous. And I think most uprisings and rebellions, there's a spontaneous element to them, right? At some point, there's a trigger and the flash happens and like people come out, right? But, there's longtime community organizations in Southern California, in the LA area, that have dealt with migrant rights protections. I mean, and this goes back decades, right? So you have organizations. Some of these organizations were actually, I actually received a letter from Congress, I think, from a U.S. senator saying you need to come and testify, and we want to know your role in kind of supposedly bankrolling or organizing this criminal activity that essentially was a community coming together to take out these ICE thugs and to protect their family members, to protect their community members, right? One of these organizations, community organizations, being Unión del Barrio. It's been around for a long time, right? So, we can connect this in a bunch of different ways, right? I think if we can go back to the 1980s with the sanctuary movement that developed throughout the United States to allow and to protect and to allow Central American refugees to gain entrance into the United States. You have a diverse group of religious organizations and community organizations that essentially created an underground railroad for Central American refugees that were fleeing, U.S. sponsored death squad regimes that were, in some instances, like in Guatemala, were waging genocide against indigenous populations. In the 1990s, since you grew up in California too, Adnan, you remember that in many ways, what we've seen with Trump, particularly the first Trump administration, is a rehash at the national level of what we experienced growing up in California in the 1990s, right? Like the California in the 1990s was not this liberal utopia that it's misrepresented today in mainstream media and understanding in the United States. Like in the 1990s, you had someone by the name of Pete Wilson, as governor, who was a horrific white nativist who actually advised. I don't know if he's alive, but I know he was advising Trump on during his first presidency. This guy had been mayor of the city of San Diego in the 1980s, organized all sorts of series of horrific anti-migrant actions, really deployed a white nativist terroristic discourse against undocumented migrants. He wins to a certain extent. Because of that, he wins the governorship in the 1990s. And, we witnessed things like Prop 187, a state level proposition that tried to essentially create an even lower category of personhood for undocumented migrants than they already had occupied by not allowing them to have any sort of like state rights. And I remember that that then sparked all sorts of protests throughout the country, right? Or throughout California. So that's part of this genealogy, right? That I think fed the community uprising that happened in Paramount and Compton a couple of weekends ago. And I remember growing up being a really tense moment because at that point, my parents were going through the legalization process and it was still kind of up in the air, right? So, seeing someone like Pete Wilson deploy this type of horrific discourse and different anti-migrant policy was there was a lot of fear and anxiety in my household. And then we can talk about the migrant rights mass movement that developed in the 2000s, particularly around 2006, 2007, when you had these massive marches in most U.S. major cities, but especially in Southern California. And then you have also efforts in the 90s and 2000s to unionize undocumented migrants, and in the 90s and early 2000s, you had moments where these unionization efforts led to, particularly after the war on terror in 2001, you had unions attack ICE, like to prevent ICE from detaining and deporting their own undocumented union members. So there's in LA specifically since the 2000s, there's been a really interesting interconnection between union and unionization drives of migrant labor that then also moves to a broader civic and citizenship rights for undocumented migrants. And I think we see that convergence of like economic and political rights is also at the bottom of these community uprisings. And they're not going to stop, right? I just saw a video from 2 days ago in Bell, which is a city, I guess, a little east of Los Angeles proper, where they did something similar, right? ICE went in there, tried to detain people. And from the videos that I watched, it looked like the entire community came out and ran them out of the city. And which is proper, right? Like that's proper practice at this point. When we see what these ICE thugs are doing. I just read a report this morning that an elderly undocumented migrant who had been in the US for 40 years, working, raising a family, he died after being detained by ICE somehow, somewhere between transportation from a local jail to a federal detention facility. His family has no idea. Like his family has said he had no sort of underlying health issues, but he died. He was killed. Not he died. He was killed directly or indirectly by what these ICE thugs are doing. So, so I think there's a long history in LA proper of especially in the last 2-3 decades of that convergence of the drives for political and economic rights centered around the figure of the undocumented migrant labor.
Yeah, there's so much in that history to pick up on. And of course, I do remember, 2006-07, the massive marches and movements. And in fact, it seemed at that moment that there might be the kind of political pressure that would bring about some kind of new set of policies to regularize and legalize people's status. There was just such mass mobilization. And I think it was a shock to many people who, only consume mainstream media or live in their sort of sheltered kind of bourgeois world, that there was such a large community of people whose rights were being, taken away, or that they were embattled, and that there was some kind of organization. In some sense, though, I think and wonder if that we have witnessed, just as we did with the Obama presidency for, all of its, flaws and problems, it did sort of create a backlash, in white America of a kind of racial panic and politics of resentment. And that's something that I think is very important in trying to understand the sources of the sort of emotional and psychic and cultural sources of the right wing's rise is this politics of grievance, and also combined with a politics of sadism. And so one thing that I've been noticing is the way in which these thugs, and you rightly call them thugs, and that's another component that perhaps you might want to kind of elaborate on a little bit, because these seem to me an emblem of government power that masks itself. Literally, they're wearing masks oftentimes, and they look like street thugs, like some kind of a gang. They don't look like an organized group implementing in a kind of normal bureaucratic way. They're not wearing emblems so much typically of what we identify as, established police powers. They look like thugs, and they are acting like thugs, and they're enabling, perhaps in a way, a sort of thuggish kind of characteristic. I mean, I wouldn't be very surprised if we start seeing vigilante gangs kind of becoming very open and kind of, doing the same kind of policies, but without actually any, authorization. And so I guess my query here is really about this kind of politics of grievance and of sadism, where many people, when you see videos posted about these horrible, barbaric acts of violence by ICE to persecute and torment, and as you said, even cause the death, of people, that these are posted on social media, and you look at you're afraid to look at the comments, because what you find there is so many people posting saying, this is what we voted for. Thank God someone's finally, implementing what we want. And so I just wondered about that kind of component as well, how you would sort of think about and analyze that phenomenon that we see kind of increasing a kind of acceptance of a culture of fascism in various ways.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's so many places we can go. I mean, we can go back to the Frontier Thesis, right, and think about Frederick Jackson Turner's idea that American rugged individualism and ideas of democracy were forged in the frontier, right? When if we replace frontier with the border and we kind of mess with the framing and the standards of his judgment, right? What we can see is actually American versions of fascism begin at the border, and then they boomerang back. And I think this is one of the ways to think about the longer history of migration and migration enforcement in the United States. Just to think about ICE. ICE has only been around since the early 2000s. It's a war on terror product. It's one of more than a dozen migrant-related federal police forces whose sole focus is to do "quote unquote" migrant enforcement and to secure the borders. And that framing of securing the borders is, well, let me put it this way. I think what we've seen since at least 2001, and I would say it goes back to the 1970s, and we could talk about why this is if we want to talk about the rise of this idea of like the "quote unquote" the illegal or the undocumented migrant that represents this like specter that worries Americans, ruling elites. ICE begins as a war on terror, as a product of the war on terror, and they become increasingly empowered throughout its 2-3 decades of existence. They're supposed to be doing internal enforcement of immigration laws. And remember, like if you come into the United States, "quote unquote" undocumented without papers, that's like a civil misdemeanor, right? Like it's not. But the way that this idea it's been instrumentalized in the last 3-4 decades, even before ICE existed, is that an undocumented migrant coming into the United States and violating the United States equals violating the sovereignty of the United States. Therefore, it represents a border security issue, and therefore the United States is somehow unsafe. And that framing has been wholly adopted by both political parties. It's been adopted in different ways with different styles and rhetoric, but it's been adopted by mainstream media, from the fascistic right to the liberal center left, however we want to carry it. The idea that immigration and the border represent security issues, and that border security is something that we need to think about and to care about in the way that they're telling us to, solely through the lens of like enforcement, militarization, police work, that runs the gamut of political parties and media in this country, and that creates like it helps create and has helped create since the 1970s at least the structure of feeling that the migrant, particularly undocumented migrant, is a figure to fear, and it's a figure to police, and it's a figure to go after, it's a figure to detain and to expel. And again, there's for me, the way I see it is that there's a difference in style, there's a difference in rhetoric, but it's the same underlying structure and way of viewing this issue for both political parties and across the media landscape in the United States. And this is why, since at least Obama, the Democrats fall into the trap of the Republicans in that they never escape this broader structure. They never escape this broader presupposition or idea that border security is paramount, that border militarization is paramount, and that going after undocumented migrants is paramount, because these figures somehow are dangerous and they undermine the sovereignty of the United States. So what we get when Obama becomes the deporter in chief, or Kamala Harris talks about how she was tougher on the border than even Donald Trump, you're basically making the same argument. What you're saying is, the Democrats can do a better, smarter, more efficient way of doing the exact same things that the Republicans want to do. Now, there's a different function, though, within, if we think about the political base of each party. The Democrats don't want to be seen detaining and deporting people who have been in this country for decades and have just been here working and raising families. So what they do is it's out of sight, out of mind. And for decades, and you really saw this during the Obama years, is they will say, well, we have to do this. We have no choice. We're bound by law. And we're also forced to do this because we have a quote unquote, a broken immigration system that Congress will not fix. So we've been hearing this thing called comprehensive immigration reform for 2 or 3 decades now. And what it actually has served as for the Democrats is cover for their deportation regime that they created, that they enhanced, that they enlarged, that they empowered with ICE at the center, and that they then handed over to someone like Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump's political base, they require something different. They want to see the cages. They want to see the tackling of migrants who are running away from these ICE thugs. They want to see family separation, right? So that there is a political sadism in certain parts of his political base where they need to see migrant suffering to obtain their political support. But that's the difference, right? It's a narrative difference and it's a stylistic difference. But fundamentally, what they're both doing is dealing with the symptomatic manifestations of deeper lying historical and structural reasons. Like, and this is one thing I push my students to think about. And anytime I do media where we talk about migration, is the border is the violence. Right? The deportation regime is the violence. The migrants themselves are not the violent ones. There's a violent system at play here. And if we step back and we think about why these people are even coming here, well, then that's going to lead us to critically interrogate U.S. empire in Latin America, U.S. empire in the Caribbean, past and present. Because as we know, to quote the Puerto Rican journalist Juan Gonzalez, Latin American and Caribbean migrants to the U.S. are the harvest of U.S. empire. And it continues to be this way, right? It might have been, direct military intervention in the 19th and early 20th century that then displaced people and encouraged them to come to the United States. In the last 2 decades, we've seen how economic war and sanctions have robbed people of the right to stay at home in countries like Venezuela and Cuba. These people want a better life for their families. They want a better life for their communities, for themselves. So what do? They take the very rational choice to leave. They're coerced to leave, right? So if we actually had an honest media, if we had an honest opposition political party that thought about this issue structurally and historically, they would not continuously operate on the terrain, linguistic and narrative terrain set forth by white nativists and white nationalists. Because at the heart of this, and if you follow Stephen Miller, Trump's advisor, it's very clear that what that guy wants is a white nationalist project of ethnic cleansing. And they did this in the first Trump administration. They talked about how their historical referent for dealing with migration and dealing with U.S. demography were the 1920s. Was the 1924 National Origins Act, which was a eugenicist, white supremacist act that essentially only allowed Northern Europeans the legal ability to come to the United States. All the other swarthy Europeans, and I just did quotation marks for those of you listening, all the other swarthy Central, Southern Europeans, Iberian, you couldn't come. Jewish populations in Europe couldn't come. Asian populations had already been barred, right, from the Chinese Exclusion Act of the late 19th century up until the 1924 National Origins Act. The one group that was granted, and this is another contradiction that exists to this day in this debate, the one group of people who were granted an exception to this barring of non-white peoples, whiteness as defined by the Americans at that point, were Latin Americans, specifically Mexicans. Why? Because you had agribusiness interests in places like Texas in the Southwest who went to their congresspersons and said, actually, you guys, we need these laborers. We need laborers in our agribusinesses. We need laborers on our cattle ranches. If you read some of the debates in the congressional debates, it's really interesting because what the congresspersons who are representing these capitalists will say during debates is they'll say, listen, Mexican laborers are basically saying Mexican laborers are genetically suited to be unskilled laborers, one. Two, that they're not going to come here and establish communities and have kids who are then going to go on to become university professors, which makes me laugh because of my personal case. And three, they say they're like homing pigeons. They use that metaphor. They come here to work, but then they go back to Mexico, right? Because for them, Mexico is their home, their site of attraction. And that's why the migrants from the Western Hemisphere were not included within this broader white supremacist project that is the 1924 National Origins Act, which also included the foundation of the Border Patrol, which the early Border Patrol included a bunch of white supremacist Texas Rangers who just switched badges and continued to do the same type of frontier work, except they weren't necessarily, in the 1920s and 30s, they weren't necessarily going after Comanches. At that point, they were going after undocumented migrants coming mostly from Mexico. Right. And that contradiction exists to this very day. And we've seen it play out, right? You have powerful capitalists going to Trump saying, hey, you got to stop your raids, your ICE raids, because I can't find workers for my agro businesses, for my hotels, or for the service industry, for construction, et cetera, et cetera. And that's always been a wedge point in the Republican white nativist right? The contradiction between what they want to see racially and culturally versus economic logic that is always at play.
Yes, I think that's an extremely important point and observation about those tensions between, the white supremacist settler colonial origins of the United States and its continuing, logics, particularly for this kind of white nationalist community, and capitalism, and the problem of finding cheap, mobile, labor that's easily exploited, that can also undermine organized labor, as a technique of capital. And so it'll be very interesting to see. And of course, that was, at an elite level, even, played out early in the Trump administration when, there were tensions between MAGA world and, Elon Musk and the tech, the tech boys, interest in, recruiting, Indian, for example, Indian engineers and software specialists, and kind of making outrageous kinds of remarks about, their suitability, which is a little bit similar, like the reverse of the kind of racist characterization of the suitability of Mexican, farm labor genetically. So, yeah, quite important or interesting. But, coming back to point that you made about the institution of ICE as a product of the global war on terror and the importance of the securitization and militarization of the issue of immigration. And this seems to me something very fundamental in the logics of American empire, is this interaction between the goals of U.S. imperial hegemony, over the globe, and the aspirations and effective implementation of that, and pursuit of that. And, on the other hand, the erosion, the way in which those forces and policies then have their own, just as you were saying about the border, that the border boomerangs back, is that the empire sort of boomerangs back in terms of the erosion of domestic freedoms and rights. And it seems like that has been that the Islamophobia of the global war on terror has been absolutely fundamental to being able to expand the securitization of life in the U.S., particularly around questions of immigration as a national security issue. And this is partly what explains the way in which the Democrats and the Republicans are nearly indistinguishable at the policy level, even if, as you pointed out, there are these stylistic and other kinds of differences. And that is because when it comes to national security and foreign policy and those kinds of issues, there's always this condominium, of shared conceptions. And the more that is effective or important in framing issues in American political life, the more you see this uniparty sort of approach. And so I'm wondering if maybe you have any further kind of thoughts or observations on the way in which what we've been observing in terms of, and, maybe somebody like Mahmoud Khalil is a, kind of great symbolic example of the way in which, these coercive powers of the state applied to those who aren't full citizens. And we'll see, the erosion of that boundary soon too, I'm sure. But, the way in which for foreign policy reasons, there was wide latitude for being able to deploy, coercive powers of these immigration thugs, ICE thugs, to disappear a person, and maybe the symmetries between U.S. policy abroad and how it's shaping vis-a-vis Palestinian issue and others. Of course, many things have happened in the last few days, and this militarization, of the immigration question.
Yeah, no, I think. Listen, for me, one of the interesting. This is a great question, and for me, one of the interesting things about this topic that links anti-migrant politics, anti-migrant policies, the structural brutalization of migrants to U.S. empire, is it all comes back at the U.S.-Mexico border to a certain extent, right? So during the 1980s, you had a bunch of ex-Vietnam soldiers who become radicalized, become ferocious anti-communist white nationalists, who then become like border vigilantes in the 1980s, right? Because they were supposedly protecting the U.S. from anti-communist Central American migrants coming into the U.S., right? And you see a similar dynamic happen in the early 2000s, where you have veterans from the invasion of Afghanistan or the invasion of Iraq come back disillusioned, and they become members of the Minutemen, which is like a 2000s iteration of border vigilantes. And, they'll say things like, there's I can't remember, the sociologist who went around talking to these Minutemen. Can't remember the sociologist's name, but in their book, they taught the sociologist is talking to one of the Minutemen, and the Minutemen is the one saying, "This is our Gaza," and he's pointing at Mexico. Or they say, "Look, we want to build a border wall," and then the specs for the border wall that they show the sociologist who's like embedded with them are like the wall specs that the Israelis were using in the West Bank. There's also, the kind of discourse that's coming from the right and politicians in the 2000s and early 2010s will just say things like Al-Qaeda is setting up training camps in Mexico. And they're training these Al-Qaeda militants to then become undocumented migrants. They adopt Spanish surnames, and then they'll cross into the U.S., right? And then you have Minuteman vigilantes say, "Oh, yes, we've seen the evidence of this in the Sonoran Desert. We've seen prayer rugs. We've discovered prayer rugs," right? So you had alleged Al-Qaeda militants with Latino last names infiltrating the U.S. when we know, the original 9/11 terrorists, they came through the other border. But anyway, we don't have to talk about that. So that's one way. I mean, another way to think about this is, and this started to happen with the Border Patrol, particularly during the Cold War, is that you had there was a number of Border Patrol officials who then were sent to Latin American death squad and military dictatorships to train their Latin American police forces, right? And these were guys who had cut their teeth at the U.S.-Mexico border. I think we've probably seen a similar dynamic in the post 9/11 as well, where you have this circular movement of military personnel who went to carry out invasions in Afghanistan and Iraq, come back and become ICE or Border Patrol members, some of which may then become members of BORTAC, which is a special forces unit within the Border Patrol, who get sent to get training in Afghanistan and Iraq during those wars, and then they come back. BORTAC is a really problematic unit because, well, for one reason, during the 2020 George Floyd uprisings, they were deployed to Portland, and they were plucking people off the streets and throwing them into unmarked vans, and then taking them to unmarked, they were domestically rendered in unmarked vehicles in unmarked prisons, and then later released, right? So they were acting as like Latin American death squads from the 60s and 70s. And that BORTAC they were recently deployed in LA during some of the uprisings and the resistance of the last 2 weeks. And this is a unit, again, that most likely has a high number of military veterans who were deployed abroad in U.S. imperial work and then were resent abroad to be retrained as part of this Border Patrol Special Forces unit, right? And so some of this has to do, I think Todd Miller, who's a great journalist based here near me in Tucson, has a book I highly recommend called Empire of Borders, where he makes a really good connection between U.S. empire and the work of externalizing U.S. borders beyond U.S.-Mexico border and the Canadian U.S. border. One of the ways they do so is to use police units and to train police units throughout the world to set up border checkpoints far away from the United States, quote unquote, motherland or fatherland, or however these fascists want to define it. And that's imperial work. That's imperial work that existed before the war on 9/11, before the war on terror in 9/11, and it continues in full effect today. And the case of someone like Khalil Mahmoud is really interesting because it reminded me of a case that happened in LA actually in the late 80s. That I think they were called the Los Angeles 7, Los Angeles 8, which is people of West Asian descent who were accused of supporting the PFLP. And the U.S. government tried to, using very dubious legal argumentation, tried to strip them of any sort of right and deport them from the country. And it took well into the early 2000s for the Los Angeles 7 or the Los Angeles 8, sorry, I forget, to win their case. They won in right after the global war on terror had commenced, right? So this is one of the reasons why I think about the Palestine-Mexico border not just being like a material space, but it's an ideological space where U.S. empire and U.S. support for Israeli settler colonialism and genocide converge with issues of migration, issues of who's allowed to be in the United States and who's not allowed to be in the United States, and issues of what kind of rights migrants are allowed to exercise when they're in the United States. And someone like Mahmoud, this ridiculous argument that little Marco Rubio deployed, right? That he's what he was saying was a national security threat, and therefore we can send him to a privately run for-profit federal migrant detention unit in Louisiana.
Yeah. I think, I'm wondering if the book was Waiting for Jose, the Minutemen's Pursuit of America. Yes. Harold Shapira.
Yes.
Who did a kind of ethnographic sociological study. Yes. Well, there's so much, to talk about. I mean, I do want to ask you about, maybe the future or at least the politics of these uprisings and whether they can make some of the connections that you were just making between U.S. wars and empire abroad and its consequences for fascistic ethnic cleansing fantasies within and those policies in a moment. But before discussing that, I did want to ask how it looks from the other side of the border. I know that, as you were just talking about, these militarized groups, vigilantes, as well as, government agencies, foster a kind of securitized perspective that we've just been speaking about, but quite apart from the connections with global war on terror actors like Al-Qaeda camps in Mexico and so on, they've also, been pursuing a discourse around gangs, criminal, smuggling, drugs, the fentanyl crisis, sexual slavery, there's just a myriad of associated criminality with the border coming across from Mexico. And so there's a lot of very aggressive discourses about needing to expand U.S. control into Mexico in order to solve this problem, of these gangs. And so that's just one example of aggression around the border that I was wondering, how is this, how is Mexico responding to this, and how would you analyze this from the Mexican perspective?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. I mean, I think in the last 2 or 3 weeks, it's getting lost because it just seems like so much is happening. But in the last 2 to 3 weeks, some Trump government officials and elected politicians have been crowing about how the U.S.-Mexico border is quote unquote silent, that there's no more crossings, that unlike during Biden's so-called open border policies, that that the border's closed and that people aren't actually trying. There's no encounter. To use their language, there's no encounters. This is the terminology that the Border Patrol uses, and that's obviously they're crowing about it, they're bragging about it. That's where they stop. But if that is true, and this is a question about this administration. They tend to lie a lot. They can't stop lying. They're just, they're that's all they do. Let's say if that is accurate and crossings have dropped dramatically, so-called encounters have dropped dramatically, it's probably for two reasons. One, it's a summer, and that historically crossings have always dropped in the summer because it's extremely dangerous to cross through the Sonoran Desert or through the Mexico-Texas border. It's just dangerous because of temperatures and a variety of different reasons. But the other reason is because Mexico is complicit in maintaining, regardless of who's in power in the US, Mexico is complicit in being one of these external borders that Todd Miller talks about. Mexico didn't build the wall, but Mexico itself became the wall. And this is something that has existed for decades, but it really started to ramp up in the 2010s when you started to see a large influx of Central American refugees and unaccompanied minors and children come 2010, 2011. So both the Trumpist and the Biden plans to quote unquote crack down on undocumented migration has involved recruiting Mexico to do a lot of their dirty work. So there's checkpoints throughout the country of Mexico, particularly in the south, militarized checkpoints where undocumented migrants and refugees are kind of captured and prevented from making it to the US-Mexico border. So Mexico is actually doing a lot of the dirty work that enables someone like Trump to say the US-Mexico border is silent. The other thing is what Biden did, and what Trump 1 did was to try to rewrite US refugee and asylum law and to say that they're basically we don't have any more refugee and asylum laws, and people can't really come to the US and claim asylum in violation of US and international laws. But from the Mexican perspective, they've created one big wall, a big constellation of militarized checkpoints. And they're doing a lot of work to prevent refugees and migrants from even reaching the US-Mexico border. And I think this is in a moment where we are in the second presidential administration of a political party that defines itself as leftist and progressive. But when it comes to migration policy, and this is something that began with Andrés Manuel López Obrador, he saw this accurately, that the one issue that he has leverage over the United States with is the issue of migration. And he accepted essentially to discard some of his leftist credentials and to disavow a lot of his campaign promises in the mid 2010s. And he decided to, for a variety of reasons, to serve as a U.S. colonial gendarme. And this has been continued under the current president, Claudia Sheinbaum, which is, as I've mentioned, maybe on your show and on other shows, I think that's a real shame. I understand why they're doing it. I mean, this is realpolitik. The United States is a dangerous neighbor to have. The U.S. tends to just bomb people, as we've seen, and create massive havoc around the world without thinking of consequences or human lives. So I understand why they use this as a leverage point against the U.S. empire, but it's I think traitorous on a variety of levels, and it also disavows certain historical traditions within 20th century Mexico, where the country did open its borders and its arms to accept refugees who are fleeing, Holocaust, genocides, the Francoist regime. Something like 40,000 Spanish Republican exiles found their way to Mexico in the 1930s after Franco won the Spanish Civil War. During the 1960s and 70s, when South American countries came under the horrific rule of military dictatorships, Mexico accepted thousands of refugees from Chile, from Argentina, from Uruguay, Brazil, etc. So there is a legacy that the Mexican government could draw on, but for political reasons, it's decided to work as a gringo border patrol.
Well, I mentioned that I did want to ask you about the direction that some of these resistance uprisings, based on the work you mentioned, that has a long history of community organizing and resisting, anti-immigrant persecution and so forth. There's been solidarity protests, people trying to resist ICE raids around the country. We have at this time large protests, these no king's protests against Trump in particular, and the undermining and eroding of democratic rights. And of course, there's been an ongoing pro-Palestine solidarity movement against the genocide. And now, of course, we have the U.S. Having bombed Iran, and there had been some beginnings of some mobilization for an anti-war movement. I guess in some ways, I'm wondering, is there any way that there is a path forward where some of these movements might connect with one another, connect the dots, as it were, of analysis and kind of galvanize and mobilize some sort of broad-based resistance? What do you see as the kind of prospects and futures of where, at least starting with the immigrant rights solidarity, anti-ICE raid kind of community might go forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's what remains to be seen, right? I think if there's one thing that I would urge any sort of U.S. political movement or social movement to take seriously, it's the question of anti-imperialism, and to frame our resistance to ICE within a framing and an understanding that incorporates this concept of anti-imperialism, and really trying to break down our conceptual and political understanding of domestic U.S. with an external U.S. empire, right? They're so thoroughly interconnected, right? I mean, one way to understand the Trump bombing of Iran is to it's for domestic political reasons, right? Like it could be seen that he's trying to shore up some of his political base, even at the time where it looks like it might be creating some sort of fissures. Who knows? That remains to be seen. But I think there's people on the ground resisting in LA who have lived through the consequences of U.S. empire. And I hope that they are some of the voices that are being listened to, right? I forgot to answer your question about the gangs, right? I mean, this is one of the constants in U.S. history about their borders being invaded. I mean, using that language, from the Seminoles to the Tren de Aragua Venezuelan gang, right? Like the idea that you have these invading quote unquote hordes then leading to U.S. legal changes is all premised on the idea that the U.S. is being invaded. And this goes back to the way that the U.S. system dealt with the three different wars that they waged against the Seminole peoples. And then ironically, or sick fashion, the way that they treated Seminole combatants has become the basis to treat enemy unlawful combatants during the War on Terror, right? And this is why we get then, Osama bin Laden being codenamed Geronimo during the operation that took him out, right? The specter, the original Red Scare, as our comrade Nick Estes would say, right? The original figure that haunted U.S. empire, that led to all sorts of undemocratic laws and legal apparatuses, are indigenous peoples, resisting indigenous peoples. There's people in LA who have a direct connection to how some of these street gangs formed, right? Like MS-13, which was the boogeyman of the first Trump administration, right? The idea that MS-13 is a product of U.S. empire in Central America during the 1980s. They supporting these different death squad regimes in El Salvador, supporting a military that massacred 1,000 people in El Mozote, support death squads that assassinated people like Archbishop Oscar Romero, who's now a saint. So Saint Oscar Romero, that displaced tens of thousands of Salvadorians who then made their way to Los Angeles. And because the traumatized youths had run-ins with local Mexican gangs, they decided to form their own like self-defense units that they referred to as gangs. MS-13. Now, the 1990s are also a moment of get tough on crime, 3 strikes and you're out movement. And the U.S. government used those laws to then deport people that they accused of being MS-13 members back to El Salvador. And you just see that's like the boomerang, just like flying, in its elliptical fashion. To then MS-13 becoming a political boogeyman that Trump starts to use during this first Trump administration without ever thinking about its historical origins or which force was actually responsible for its initial creation to begin with. I think that's a kind of like critical historical and political understanding that I know some of the compas on the ground in LA are trying to infuse into this broader movement. But right now, it's really an initial moment of organizing communities to run out ICE agents, some of whom are not even ICE agents, some of whom are actually just deputized individuals who are wearing masks, right? So right now, let's say the primary contradiction at the local level is to organize a community to protect family members, to protect community members against individuals who are either dressed in as civilians with masks and they just look like any normal, they could come up, a normal looking person with a mask could come up and kidnap you and you don't know what's going on, as has happened. Or they're just geared out, like just in tactical wear, and they look like military soldiers on the streets of Los Angeles going after protesters. That's the first task, and I think this is what we're seeing right now, is organizing to prevent these units and these forces from going into communities and doing whatever they want, detaining people that they have identified as undocumented migrants. And recent reporting has revealed that these ICE agents, all they care about is a body count. Like they're just going and picking up bodies because of the directives of someone like Stephen Miller and Tom Homan. They are just interested in grabbing bodies. So this is why they'll go to a Home Depot and just grab all the people there who are looking for work, regardless of legal status. They don't care. What they want are bodies. And there's pretty good reporting that has revealed how in some of these staging areas and detention areas, ICE agents are bragging about how many people they've arrested in a single day. But then the irony, or the part that's interesting to me, is when a community organizes itself and resists them, then they kind of freak out and they'll do things like they did in LA, which was paramount, I think, is call 911 because they need LAPD and the sheriffs to come in and bail them out. So yeah, I think we're in the initial stages of hopefully what I think is hopefully a broader movement of protecting our family members and our community members from ICE agents that are increasingly acting like some of these paramilitaries that we saw in Latin America during the Cold War, or in 1990s Colombia or 2000s Colombia. They have been empowered to the point where they are not following any sort of they are allowed to essentially put aside or discard U.S. laws. And what I fear is that people have already gotten hurt, but more people are going to get hurt. And what I fear is you have these maniacs on the street confronting an organized community. It might get to the point where the armed thugs decide to use lethal weapons against people who are protesting. And what happens at that point? So it's a really, I think, delicate situation. And I think ICE, from what I've read recently, ICE has tried to change some of their methodology where they'll do really quick raids to prevent people to prevent rapid response networks from organizing people to go to the spaces where they're detaining people. But if, I worry that we have another situation like in Paramount or in Compton or even in Bell. Like, what will these people do when a community stands up to them and says no more? Like, you guys are not going to be allowed to take our people. And then we haven't even mentioned the fact that there's like 500 Marines involved in this, and there's National Guard involved in protecting ICE and helping ICE engage in some of these raids, right? So yeah, I just keep thinking about the idea that if fascism was going to arrive in the U.S., it was going to come from the border, and it was going to come from the issue of migration and how U.S. political elites have been dealing with the issue of migration and anti-migrant politics since at least the 1980s, and maybe we are witnessing some of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point as well that I was going to raise, that it, of course, has also led to the deployment of U.S. troops domestically, not just the National Guard, which is already to have the president, which this is usually something the governor is authorized to do, but to have the president do so against the wishes of the governor of the state, and then to introduce actually federal troops. This is pretty amazing. We haven't seen examples of that in recent history. And so that is definitely a line that's being crossed, as so many others are. And so the lines of resistance, of course, have to form themselves likewise in new ways confronting these new forms of encroachment upon communities and upon the rights of people in this land. So anyway, Alex, I really appreciate you taking us through all of this and for all the analysis as well as the history, making these connections, especially between domestic and foreign policy, as if such a line, really is meaningful in an empire. It really isn't. And I think a lot of the examples that you brought forward historically help us hopefully see that. And I'm hopeful as well that perhaps some of these movements will engage in a way to try and combat this in a more comprehensive way, both internally and externally, to stop U.S. empire. Before you go, perhaps you can tell listeners where they can keep up with your work and follow you on social media.
I have a website that I haven't kept up with, but I will at some point. You can find a lot of my writings, alexanderaviña.com. You can, I guess, read my screaming into the void on Twitter still at Alexander_Aviña. And yeah, which is, I guess my feed has turned into this combination of just posting community resistance to ICE and retweeting and quoting Palestinians who are in desperate need of like monetary support. And I think that, man, if there's one, I thought that is like connecting the domestic and the foreign imperial, right? But yeah, so those are the places I write. I write infrequently for Foreign Exchanges, which is a foreign policy Substack run by Derek Davison. And my newest piece that I published a week or so ago, it's called The Palestine-Mexico Border. So if you want to check it out, check it out.
That would be great. And also, we're hoping Alex will join us for the inaugural edition of the Struggle Session, a new panel live stream that will be taking place on Sunday, June 29th, 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific. I'm encouraging people to join Patreon so that they can send us questions, because we'd love to have an audience engagement component and answer people's questions and help build community. And the idea here, much in the spirit of what Alex said about his social media these days, is to try and turn to some kind of practical analysis, self-criticism of our movements, and also think of highlighting some initiatives, efforts, projects that can work towards the good, towards social justice. So we look forward to seeing you and welcoming you there soon, and on this channel for a lot of other great content coming your way. Again, please like, share, subscribe to the channel. And if you can, support us on patreon.com/Adnan Hussein. But rest assured, you will always have access to great content like this.